There's a certain kind of person who has two completely different relationships with silence. In one version, silence is fine, comfortable even. You grew up with it. Long car rides with no screens. Afternoons where nothing was happening, and that was just the afternoon. Silence meant nothing was wrong. But in the other version, the one you actually live in now, silence feels like a signal, an unanswered message sitting there, waiting, a notification you haven't checked, a gap in the feed. That same silence now has weight to it. And somewhere in the back of your mind, it requires a response. You were born between 1976 and 1985. And that specific collision, the person who knows silence is fine, trapped in a world that treats silence like a malfunction, that's not a personality quirk. That's the defining psychological tension of your entire adult life. And almost nobody is talking about it with any precision. So let's get precise. You still reread a message 2 or 3 times before sending it, not because you're anxious, but because you were trained in a world where words, once spoken, couldn't be edited, where send actually meant something permanent. You instinctively lower your voice in public when a conversation gets personal, even when everyone around you is on speakerphone in a coffee shop without a second thought. You feel the shift in tone. You feel the boundary. You've caught yourself explaining to someone younger what it felt like to not know something for days and watched them look at you like you were describing life on another planet. You don't fully trust a plan unless you have a backup plan, because you grew up in a world where things just fell through and there was no live update coming, no tracking link, no reassurance. You still feel a low-grade resistance before sharing anything personal online. Not paranoia, just a reflex so old it doesn't even announce itself anymore. It just quietly says, hold that back. When a conversation ends badly, your first instinct is still to resolve it in person, not a voice note, not a paragraph of text, in person. Because that's where you learned that resolution actually happens. You can be completely absorbed in something, a book, a project, a walk, and feel genuinely restored by it. Nervous system calm, attention steady. But the moment you pick your phone back up, that restoration evaporates in about 90 seconds. You've noticed this. You just don't know what to do with it? That's not distraction. That's interference, and it has a specific psychological name. Cognitive load research describes something called dual task interference cost, the measurable penalty your brain pays when it's forced to maintain 2 incompatible processing modes at the same time, not switching between them, maintaining both simultaneously. You don't just use digital tools, you run a continuous background audit on them. Is this too permanent? Is this the right amount to share? Would I actually say this out loud to a person? That audit runs every single time. For someone who grew up online, that process was never installed. For you, it never stops running. Polyvagal theory adds something important here. Your nervous system learned to regulate in an environment with natural edges. School ended at a specific time. Stores closed. The phone stopped ringing after a certain hour. Those weren't just social conventions, they were physiological cues that told your body, the day is over, you can release now. Digital life doesn't have those edges. The signal is continuous. Your nervous system is still looking for the off-ramp that no longer exists, which is why you can feel genuinely tired without being able to point to why. Research on identity consolidation, specifically how autobiographical memory forms during late adolescence, tells us that the self you built before external feedback loops became constant is more internally anchored than one built inside them. You developed a sense of who you were before who you are became a metric. That's not a small thing, but it also means you now carry a version of yourself that the current environment was never designed for. But here's where it gets complicated. You didn't just witness the internet arrive. You had skin in the game at every stage of it. You were there when email was genuinely exciting, when social media felt like reconnecting, not performing, when having a profile felt like a choice rather than an obligation. You adopted each new layer enthusiastically because you're adaptable, because you're curious, because that's what your generation does. And then, somewhere in your 30s, the architecture shifted underneath you without announcing itself. The tools you'd chosen started choosing you back. The platforms that once felt optional became professionally and socially non-negotiable. The version of the internet you'd signed up for quietly became something else entirely. and the exit doors were gone. This is the thread we pulled on in the video about why Xennials feel older than their age. That specific exhaustion that isn't about the hours you've worked or the sleep you've missed. What we didn't get to say is that part of what makes it so disorienting is that you remember agreeing to something different. You have the receipts. And living inside a system you watched transform from something you chose into something you're subject to produces a very particular kind of cognitive dissonance that younger generations don't have access to and older ones mostly opted out of. You're the only group who stayed, and staying has a cost. Which brings you to the paradox you probably recognize but rarely say out loud. You are fluent in the digital world, but you don't fully trust it. You can move through it efficiently, and you do, but there's always a translation layer running. You're independent to a degree that sometimes surprises people, yet you're quietly depleted in ways that independence doesn't fix. You adapt faster than you let on, but every adaptation costs something that doesn't replenish on its own. You're not struggling to keep up. You're struggling with the continuous overhead of keeping up while also knowing, in a way that's not abstract but lived, that something real was traded away in the process. That's not dysfunction. That's accurate perception. And accurate perception of a bad trade is exhausting to carry. Here's what actually got lost. Not in a nostalgic way. In a practical, psychological way. You lost low-stakes ambiguity. In the world you grew up in, most situations didn't need to be read carefully. A friend not calling back just meant they were busy. Now, every gap in communication is a text that can be analyzed for tone, timing, and subtext. The interpretive load of daily relationships has increased dramatically, and your nervous system, calibrated for a simpler signal environment, bears that load constantly. You also lost the right to be a work in progress without an audience. You developed in private, the awkward years, the wrong choices, the versions of yourself you eventually outgrew. Those were allowed to just end. There's a specific psychological freedom in that. Not everyone reading this will have had it, but you did, and you know what it felt like. And living without it now is a subtler loss than most people around you are equipped to understand. Here's the reframe, and it's not the one you're expecting. The reason you feel the friction so acutely isn't because you failed to adapt. It's because you adapted completely while retaining the reference point. You know what the current system costs because you have something to compare it to. That's not a liability. In systems thinking, that's called comparative calibration, and it's genuinely rare. You can recognize manipulation in an algorithm because you remember what organic felt like. You can build real trust in a relationship because you know what trust looked like before it was performed. You can tolerate not knowing something immediately because you've done it for years and survived just fine. In a cultural moment where almost everyone is native to the current system and therefore invisible to its distortions, you have something quietly invaluable, the ability to see the water you're all swimming in. That's not a small thing to carry, but it is yours. If this named something you've been living inside without a language for it, there are other videos here looking at different corners of this same experience, how it shapes the way you attach, go quiet, and build trust differently, not to define you, just to hand you a better map of something you've already been navigating. If this helped you even a little, please subscribe and stay with me. It means more than you think.